Despite being extremely influential to the development of not just the German early war doctrine, but also conflicts as early as the Spanish Civil War, the Panzer I and II are often overlooked in favor of the bigger, more glamorous tanks from later in the war. However, even as their feline ancestors took the field, these early panzers would still see combat in a variety of roles. In today's episode, we will be looking at one such example of a modification made to the Panzer II to allow it to fill the role of a combat reconnaissance vehicle, a tank which has since become more well known for its reputation as a seal clubber's wet dream in the game World of Tanks. Today, we look at the Panzer II J. Today's video is brought to you by Keeps. Just like a tank will begin to rust if not properly maintained, most guys will start to have some level of hair loss as they get older. Thankfully, Keeps offers clinically proven treatments shown to stop hair loss and improve growth. With the help of their network of expert medical advisors, prescribers, and care specialists, you can not just get the treatments you need, but also connect with your prescribing doctor for any questions or concerns for free included with your treatment plan. This is all done without the need for a dreaded trip to the doctor's office or pharmacy, something no one looks forward to, especially with how crazy things still are. Once you get a treatment plan prescribed to you, your orders are shipped directly to your door, usually at around half the cost you would pay normally. Most guys won't start to see results until around 6 months after starting treatment, so don't wait and let your hair loss get any worse. Hair loss stops with Keeps. To get 50% off your first order, go to keeps.com/ConeOfArc or click the link in the description. That's keeps.com/ConeOfArc. Thanks again to them for sponsoring today's video. Now let's get into today's topic. The program which would birth the Panzer II J was started on November 24, 1938. That tank would be just one design that would arise from the assault tank program, which looked to create tanks with thicker armor than their earlier counterparts. More specifically, they were to have 80mm of frontal armor to protect from the 50mm Pak-38. This was being pursued due to the threat posed by the defenses of the various territories surrounding Germany and more specifically their fortifications. As any Willbuh with a basic knowledge of World War II will tell you, the Maginot Line, which was by far the most major of these, was eventually defeated by simply bypassing the defenses altogether, but with the other targets of Nazi Germany's expansion plans also having significant fortifications built up, this was an understandable precaution. Although this program likely helped sow the seeds of the out-of-control Super Heavy program several years later, not all of the spawn of this concept were quite as ridiculous. We previously discussed the tank known as the Panzer I-F, which is essentially a fraternal twin to the Panzer II J. Despite being separate projects, both bore similarities and shared numerous design aspects, including some of the components they used. This was largely due to the influence of a man named Kneipkamp, who some of you may recall from the E100 project we discussed previously. The designers of the Panzer I-F, Krauss-Maffei, and the designers of the Panzer II J, MAN, had previously been working on light tank projects designated VK601 and VK901 respectively. Due to Kneipkamp's influence, these designs were quite similar, and with the heavier vehicles being further developments of those programs, it only made sense that they would share those same similarities. Due to this, the final designs designated VK1801 by Krauss-Maffei and the VK1601 by MAN were eventually unified into one project on November 15, 1939, when both companies demonstrated their vehicles. Although both vehicles would retain separate designations, both companies would work collaboratively on parts of the design. For this reason, it was decided to split the work between the two companies, with work on the suspension being given to Krauss-Maffei and MAN being put in charge of the drive sprockets, final drives, and transmission components. Both vehicles would utilize the same drivetrain made up of the 150 horsepower Maybach HL45 and a 6-speed gearbox. This would allow the Panzer II J a speed of 23.4 km per hour on roads and 12.6 km off-road on average. The hull and turret designs would be where the project split, with the VK1601 being wider than its brother, however both would have the same armor thicknesses. As for the turrets, these were designed and produced by Daimler-Benz. Again, the designs would differ here, with the turret for the VK1801 being rounded, whereas the VK1601 would be a more box-like shape. In total, 4 experimental tanks for each type were ordered to be built, followed by an order of 30 pilot tanks of each design. With armor plates supplied by Krupp, the first complete vehicle was ready in June of 1940. Aside from a slight difference in the shape of the early turrets, with the experimental ones having distinct cheeks covering the mantlet sides which were later removed, the tanks were largely unchanged when accepted for production. By this point though, the campaigns into Poland, France, and Czechoslovakia, as well as the Anschluss of Austria, had already occurred, and the need for this tank was essentially gone. Despite this, the 2 heavy light tank programs would remain at a simmer in the background for the next few years, with parts slowly trickling in and initial pilot production being worked on until December 1942. Following this, further Panzer I-F and Panzer II J production orders were cancelled. The exact number of VK1601 series to be completed seems to be a somewhat contradictory subject, as different sources provide different figures. From what I was able to find though, it would seem the initial batch of 30 was more than likely completed. Strangely, many sources list the number as a slightly lower 22, but I believe this to be due to confusion in how the production was split. Quoting directly from Panzer Trax 2-2, the number of VK1601 released to IN-6 from new production each month is 4 in April, 3 in May, 4 in June, 2 in July, 1 in September, 2 in October, 2 in November, and 2 in December 1942, for a total of 22 in 1942, in addition to the 8-0 series VK1601 completed in 1941. While I can't say with absolute certainty without the original documentation, this combined with reports saying that 30 sets of armor components and 30 turrets were completed seems to indicate to me that 30 is the total number produced. Unlike its sibling, the Panzer II J was equipped with a 2cm KWK-38 autocannon, which was a significant step up from the paltry dual MGs the Panzer I-F featured. Alongside this cannon, the Panzer II J also retained a coaxial MG-34. 3 crew members would man the machine, with the commander gunner in the turret and the radio operator and driver in the hull. Again, a step up from the 2-man crew of the Panzer I-F. There was one alternative armament proposed for this tank, known as the Panzerkampfwagen Flammenwerfer VK1601 Flammpanzer, which would have been a variant equipped with a flamethrower. Despite a proposed production of just under 200 units, this was never started due to another Flammpanzer project already under contract. When it comes to the combat history of this little tank, it can essentially be summed up by saying it performed slightly better than the Panzer I-F. The better armament and increased crew count would certainly have helped when engaging the enemy, but that's not to say it did exceptionally well either. Originally, 5 of these, along with 5 Panzer I-Fs, would join the 1st Tank Company of the 66th Special Purpose Battalion, alongside some other oddities, such as at least 1 captured KV-2 for Operation Hercules. In preparation for this, the tanks would receive tropical camouflage schemes, but with the invasion of Malta being cancelled, their combat debut would instead be on the Eastern Front near Leningrad, now with 7 Panzer II Js in tow. Their first foray into combat would occur as part of the Sieniewina offensive, where the tanks would fail spectacularly. The little tanks themselves can't really be blamed for this failure though, as rather than assaulting enemy fortifications like they had been designed for, they were tasked with attacking through swampy terrain. With the Panzer II J weighing well over 17 tons, it should be clear what the result was. By the end of September, at least 3 tanks were lost due to them becoming stuck in the mud, with another being knocked out. These tanks were eventually recovered, but 2 had been damaged so severely they required being sent back for repairs in Germany. Of the total 7 tanks which had entered combat, all were broken down by the end of December 1942, not exactly a shining start for the program. A further 10 tanks would arrive at the tail end of December, only to quickly follow their brethren to the repair shops. with 2 of those completely lost not long after arrival and unreliability being common among the remaining tanks. Only 5 to 7 of the Panzer II Js were operational at any given time. Eventually, the tanks were completely withdrawn from combat service and instead tasked as anti-partisan vehicles throughout occupied territories. Notably, they were used in France, Yugoslavia, and alongside Panzer Is in Belarus. Although some sources make claims that these tanks saw combat in Kursk, there does not seem to be any truth to this, as the tanks were reportedly unmanned at the beginning of July 1943, and by the 10th had been transferred to Krupka, meaning they were only potentially near the Battle of Kursk for a short time at most. Over the remainder of their service, the tanks would continue in their role as policing vehicles until eventually all were lost. The last reported use of these tanks in their unmodified form was by Panzer Company 350 with a strength of 4 vehicles. The last notable detail in the story of this tank occurred when the Allies discovered one which had been modified to serve as a recovery vehicle with its turret removed and a small crane fitted in place of it. Although 2 Panzer Is remain on display today, the Panzer II J has unfortunately been lost to history. Despite this rather unremarkable service life, it has often been said that these tanks earned the nickname Baby Tiger by their crews and the Russians who faced them. However, this seems more likely to have originated post-war, as the Tiger did not see battle until after the Panzer II J had been removed from the front lines. It's possible this originated later in the war, but judging by how it performed in regular combat, I find this unlikely. In the end, the Panzer II J was a strange tank with no real-world application. With only a 20mm cannon, it was all but useless against enemy armor or fortifications, and its weight made it fairly impractical for a role as a recon vehicle. Although it did find some use as a reserve unit against partisans, that role could just as easily have been filled by other, far cheaper designs. Ironically, the interchangeability of parts between the Panzer II J and Panzer I was probably the one redeeming factor of their designs had they seen mass production. This would have cut costs in manufacturing and improved spare parts supply, but Germany would never fully take advantage of that in their World War II designs until far too late in the war for any noticeable impact. Even in the case of these pocket heavies, it did relatively little to solve their reliability issues. As with many German armor designs, this one was probably best left on the drawing board. Thanks for watching, and I hope you enjoyed today's video. I actually learned a lot myself while working on it and corrected a number of my own misconceptions that I'd heard over the years about it. Hopefully it helped teach you something, and if not, well, you clearly know your tanks. One last thanks to my ConelyFans and to Keeps for sponsoring today's video. Don't forget to use that link down below to save 50% on your first order. I'll see you in the next video.